Okay. Sorry. Okay. Can everybody see and hear wherever you are? Thank you, man. Okay. So, community preference for rigs-to-reefs. This is joint work. This is based off a master's thesis by Veronica, who just completed this year and is now headed back to Argentina, supervised by myself and Johanna. This presentation is basically reporting what she did, plus I've added some bells and whistles to the estimation. So it's not quite what she did, but it's the underlying framework is her thesis, and I've just added some tweaks to it. Really? Now you don't want to? Okay, what's the issue? So offshore oil and gas infrastructure, as in all the rigs and pipes and so on, is getting older. It's running towards the end of its usable life. And the question is, what happens to that? Current regulations say that it needs to be completely removed. That's the default setting, is that it needs to be completely removed and essentially the seafloor put back to its base state. There's an estimate, and these vary, that there might be $21 billion worth of costs for Australia over the next 30 years in terms of that decommissioning process. So it's an expensive thing, which is sort of got the focus of both the industry and regulators. So there's this idea as to whether or not you could have this idea of in situ decommissioning. So actually not complete removal and disposal on land, but actually using it in water somehow. So those are actually permitted in the regulations, but you have to show that there are environmental benefits and that there's sort of no net other impacts to the environment or whatever, or to navigation or whatever. So, but potentially you could get permission to actually do this, to leave stuff in the water. So there's various different versions of what this means, as in you can either leave it where it is, but just sort of take the top off. You can topple it over or decommission it in place. You could move it to some other site, to a reefing site, or the complete removal is that you need just to ship it off to land and process. For any of the reefing options, you've got to make sure that basically the material leaving there is inert, as in you have to clean it up as much as you would do if you were taking it off out of land. So that you can't, this isn't a reason for leaving stuff which is going to pollute left in the water. If it's going to be left there, it has to basically be stable and not have any environmental impacts. So in principle, you could use this oil and gas infrastructure as artificial reefs. What's the position around the world? The USA, they've had a big rigs-to-reefs program happening for ages. Asia, there's some programs happening in Malaysia and Brunei in order to do it. In Europe and in the North Sea, their regulations favor complete removal of the rigs. And if you are going to put in artificial reefs, it has to be virgin material. It can't be recycled stuff. So there's difference in terms of proposals and attitudes around the different approaches. There's all sorts of issues about what happens when you do this. There's sort of the plus points, the things that are argued as being good. Habitat provision, enhancement of biodiversity, might lead to greater fish production. There's examples in the US where it is, but rigs-to-reefs are essentially supporting entire fisheries. Alternatively, it might be seen as a protection from trawl fishing, because you've got this big chunk of infrastructure there, so trawls can't go through it. So de facto, you're getting a sort of a protected area. You might be able to put, because you're usually putting these reefs in areas where there isn't other underwater infrastructure or structures, and therefore you can sort of build connectivity. And then the downsides, okay, you're moving this stuff about, you might be moving non-native species around, potential navigation and snagging hazards if you put it in the wrong place. Might be some contamination if you've got corrosion. And if it, but also when you're removing stuff though, and moving it, then you may also have that same sort of disturbance issue. So it's on the one hand, on the other sort of situation. So what's surprising a bit to us is that there doesn't seem to have been any studies which look at public's attitudes towards this. So this is a paper by Chandler. Okay, holistic approach, look at everything, and particularly look at the value of stakeholders for the different options, where stakeholders could be quite broadly defined. And this is the one from Jenny Schroer from WAMSI in a recent report for WA. It's not clear if stakeholders and the general community will support a shift in policy towards not having complete removal. So that was sort of the gap in the literature. And as far as we're aware, there's nothing published in this area, but I'm going to come back to this at the end. But so there just seems to be this like an interesting problem to talk about. So what are the objectives? These are the objectives of Veronica's thesis. Try to work out, identify WA communities' preferences towards the rig-to-reefs process as an alternative to complete removal. What are the values for different attributes for the rigs? And then particularly we want to, or had the idea, we wanted to look at people's social license to operate, which they might have awarded to the oil and gas industry, and whether or not that actually has an influence on their preferences for rigs-to-reefs. So this idea of, you know, what's my view of the oil and gas industry in general? Does that influence how I actually might behave when I'm presented with these types of questions that we're about to present to them? So this is a survey-based approach. We've got a relatively big sample provided by an online commercial market research company. Started off with about 431, representative by age and gender. We had some speedsters who went through, and I'm not quite sure how some of them managed it. In less than 5 minutes, they managed to complete the survey. They've been given the flick. They're out of the sample. So we've got 392 people in the sample. This is the core, the heart of what we're doing. For anybody who's familiar with these types of approaches, this is very familiar. And I'm going to be possibly a bit brief in describing this, but essentially what we do is we present people with these options. So the option 3 is complete removal, which is sort of the status quo option as currently is. And then we're offering them the possibility of saying, well, but instead of removing this rig, what we could have done is we could have converted it to a reef. And there's 2 different options we could do. And there's a set of things, attributes in which we're going to describe what happens when we remove that rig and convert it into a reef. And these are coming out of the literature in terms of what people are saying are possible outcomes. So it's about what's the total fish biomass that's associated with these infrastructure if it's left in the water. There's a big ecological question around this infrastructure as to whether the fish you see there have been attracted to it or whether they've been produced by it. So if it's been produced by it, you've actually sometimes increased the overall biomass in the system. If all that's happening is they're moving from somewhere else to it, then, well, you've attracted it. It must be improving their welfare because they've made that change. Must be utility maximizing for the fish if they've made the choice to go to the... but possibly we might not think from our perspective it's quite as impressive if what they're doing is just aggregating as opposed to producing. There's some evidence that some of these things have been created as habitat for threatened species, so iconic species. So is that happening, yes or no? Who can access the reef? And this has got 3 levels. We said it was either no access, so it's like a little marine park, basically, nobody can get in there, or wreck fishers could get in to fish it, or wreck divers could get in to dive. So those are the alternatives. The important one, which is going to transpire, is the one of liability. And the issue of liability has turned up in various places in the government report on decommissioning in terms of issues and what concerns might be as to who holds the liability after the reef is in place. So at the moment, while you're operating as oil production, the company has responsibility for what happens there. If you've gone to a state of complete removal, then basically once your lease is over, then your liability is finished. Now we're going to have a situation where possibly we're going to topple, remove, put this infrastructure back into the sea somewhere. Who has liability for what happens with it? And at the moment, I don't think that's clear. It's actually, that might be happening on a case-by-case basis in Australia. So the 3 we set up was that either the company did, so irrespective of how long it was there, if it was their stuff that they've left behind, they have liability, or it's the government, the taxpayer, takes over responsibility, or it's shared between the 2, so the 3 levels again. The last one, traditionally, if you're doing a valuation study like this, you would have a cost attribute, as in, so you want to work out what you're willing to pay for the resource or for the attributes. So we'd be asking, you know, what you're willing to pay in extra tax to achieve these outcomes. That seems unlikely to fly in this context because this is basically a responsibility for the company anyway. So why should I be paying extra money in order to them do something which is probably going to save them money? So we're using the same sort of mechanism that we used with Ben and her name, I can't remember, we were doing mine site rehabilitation, where we basically say there might be some consequences in terms of the state budget. So this is there's going to be more money flowing back into the state budget as a result of them doing a rigs-to-reef option. This is an argument that's been made by the industry, and essentially what's going to happen is that because they're going to potentially reduce their costs, it will increase their profits, and that potentially will increase the royalty flows that might come through. So they're allowed to offset the cost of decommissioning against the royalties or tax that they might have to pay. So we didn't go into a huge amount of detail about the financial technicalities. We basically said, well, if we do this, there might be a large amount of money flowing through to the state government, and the state government can spend that on good stuff like education, roads, whatever. But so we'd sort of hope that this is going to be a cost attribute that people are going to attend to. Okay, and those are the levels. I've sort of talked about all of them. So, so we don't just ask, for those not familiar with choice experiments, we don't ask one of those. There's 36 of those little choice sets in the system. They're blocked into 6 blocks of 6. Each person answers 6 of those. The combination of attribute levels is determined by a bit of software, experimental design software, so that in principle we can retrieve back out what it is that's driving their choices. So if there's something which is particularly attractive or something which is particularly negative about these attributes, as in I really hate the thought that the government is going to be liable for this, then what we'd expect to see is whenever one of these choice sets turns up and that liability is turning up for government, that we're going to see a low rate of selection of that option. And it's through their choices that they're making across these 3 things and the attribute levels that exist in those sets that we're going to be able to infer what it is that people value. So a standard process. Okay, so you might think we should get in here now and start estimating reporting results, but we need to back up a minute. There's 2 things we need to sort out. One, how do you measure this thing called social license to operate? We can measure other stuff, but that's like a fairly ephemeral thing. And what's this thing called a hybrid choice model? How do those fit in? Okay, social license to operate. So what we're using is a framework that was originally developed by Burton and Thompson. They developed it in the context of, say, mine sites next to towns, and they wanted to see what determined whether or not the community, sort of what they felt about and how much they approved of the mining activities. They had this idea of hierarchies, of tiers. So at the bottom level, it's one of economic legitimacy, as in they give us jobs. At the top level, it's almost that the value systems of you and the company are enmeshed. That they're the value system of the company is completely aligned with my value system. And the idea is that, well, from the company's perspective, they would like to get the highest level of social license. And, but the theory is that you can't get the higher levels until you've got the lower ones. So it's like a progressive thing. You might be able to get the economic legitimacy quite easily. You're creating jobs, spending money in the local community, but then you need to build on and get those higher levels if you want to get the whole way. So they had a whole suite of questions that they could use to identify social license. And in a paper, another master's student from some time ago now, Claire, we tried to apply that approach to the oil and gas industry, and we basically tweaked their questions in order to reflect a more general, generic question about oil and gas in the community rather than a company next door to you. So essentially Claire took the Burton and Thompson suite of these questions, and they were Likert ones, so they had to answer, you know, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree with this statement? They had a block of 15 of these questions. We modified them. Actually, we tried to keep them as close as we could, but just changed it and framed it around oil and gas in WA. So, and we've actually used those social license questions. We have then taken those and used them in some work looking at biodiversity offsets, in fact, again, in marine environment. So can we use those measures that we've got out of the social license, can we use those to explain the way that people answered these choice set questions in these papers in the context of offsets? So the thought was, we can do this again. We can repeat this process and put it into our context of decommissioning. So this is the results from the 2021, our current study. 400 people were asked this block of 15 questions. We then put it through a factor analysis. And what pops out of the factor analysis are 2 underlying factors measures, not 4, 2. One of them seems to be about economic legitimacy, the lower level, and one seems to encompass everything else. The alignment of all the factors seemed to be the same as we got on the earlier question. So the same, I think it was 4 questions that were economic, which turned up this time, turned up last time. So this looks at some sort of validity in the measures we've got. And this is a measure of the score. So each dot represents a person. Along the bottom is their estimated score for this thing called social legitimacy, 1 to 5. On the vertical, it's the extended economic. And what's really nice about this, to some extent, I think it's nice, is that we seem to be confirming the Brutellia and Thompson idea that social legitimacy is not going to be higher than economic, or economic is always greater than. If you want to get a high score on social legitimacy, you're going to have to be scoring highly on the economic. No guarantee that if you're doing well on the economic, that you're going to score well on the social. But if you're going to score well on the social, you've got to have got that previous sort of economic. So the fact that all this is turning up above the 45-degree line, we quite like. And that's exactly what we found in the 2017 paper as well. So again, there seems to be some sort of consistency going on. We might be onto something. So how are we going to use that to explain behavior? In the previous studies, what we've done is use those measures as a variable to explain choices. So we've sort of used it in the same way that you would use a variable like age or education or anything else. The problem is that runs a risk of introducing bias because those SLO factors, that measure of social license, isn't something which is definitively estimated or stated. It's not stated, it's estimated. We've created that, and presumably we've created it with error. So although we've got a number for this thing called social license for a respondent, and we've just defined it numerically as a value, 3.2 or something, actually there's no guarantee that's what's right. Our questions might be off. So there's just measurement error. And especially in these nonlinear models, measurement error causes bias. So potentially all the stuff we've been doing up to now on those previous paper has sort of got this bit of a problem sitting in there, but might have a bit of a problem sitting in there behind it. And the hybrid choice models try to overcome it. That's the reason for using these new, and the hybrid models have been around for, I'm trying to find just 2 years. Why can't I see? Okay, being used, 10 years, being used by environmental economists. Oh, okay, man. We're slow. A few people, there's a few early adopters, but it's not hugely out there in the literature. So I'm going to try to explain what a hybrid choice model is in pictures with no equations involved. So the way to think about this is anything with a square box around it is something which is observed. Anything with a circle is a latent, unobserved. So across the top here, we've got the 15 questions that we asked about the social license questions. So we split them into 2 groups. There's the 11 that are related to the social, and there's the 4 that are related to the economic. And the idea is that the answers that people gave to those questions was being driven by some underlying, unobserved, latent variable, which is their social license to operate that they're giving to the oil and gas industry. So this is a measurement model. And the idea is that where these arrows are coming from here up to here, it implies that social license is determining those values. And essentially, when you estimate this, which is effectively a whole series of ordered logit models, the coefficients that are going to be associated with these arrows are basically show you the weight that is associated with the latent variable and the answer that they've given. So there's no guarantee that these things might be significant. Potentially, some of these lines might be broken and not, there may be no relationship between them. So we can do this in 2 steps. So it looks a bit like a factor analysis, but what we're doing is that we're explaining that this latent as a function of, we're using the latent to explain the answers they've given to these measurement questions. The neat thing about the measurement model is you can put in lots of fancy correlations. So you can potentially say, well, these 2 things are independent. There's actually a correlation between the 2. And you can go further and you can actually say, well, actually there's some correlation between the answers to some of the blocks of the SLO question. So if there's something about intrinsic trust, a block of questions, perhaps the way I answer those are in some sense correlated as well, independently of my underlying base level of my latent. The other neat thing you can do is that you can start explaining this unobserved latent variable as a function of the characteristics of the individual. So we can start saying, well, we can infer what this latent is as a result of their answers, and now we can link that to their characteristics. Are they their age or their attitudes towards the environment or whatever can start turning up in here. So you can make that measurement model a bit fancy. So the hybrid is the fact that we're going to bolt all this stuff together. Because down here, we've got what looks like a traditional DCE model. So down here, we've got the utility from the alternatives. No, let's start here. We've got the observed choices. They had these little vignettes sitting here. They made a choice, 1, 2, or 3. That's our observed data. The usual assumption is they pick the one which maximizes their utility. So that's the unobservable utility. What determines the unobserved utility? It's a function of the attributes of the alternatives and their characteristics. So this bottom bit is just a bog standard DCE model where there's always this sort of implicit latent sitting underneath here, determining choices. The hybrid part comes in because now instead of using a variable which we say we have measured of social license, we're going to just make a link between our unobserved latent social variable and connect it into utility. So we're going to allow that cell to have an impact here. So the reason it's sort of the difference between the standard and this more complicated version is that we're allowing these measures here, our social license to operate, in our case, our latent variables to actually have an impact on the utility, but we haven't measured them, we're not using them as a measured variable. It's like there's some underlying parameter. So, observable characteristics of a good measure. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I don't know, the mics aren't picked. So Ben's question was, can this collapse down into just a normal model? Yes, you could test that because there's no reason why that link there actually turns out to be significant. You could just estimate these 2 things separately and say, hi, you know, but there's no impact of social license as measured on. So yes, we could test that. Okay, back to the DCE. So we collected all this data, and one of the things that we observe or check for every time we do these is to whether we've got what's known as protest behavior. And for us, a protest behavior was when they picked the status quo option, the complete removal option in all 6 of their choices. And then when we had a follow-up and said, why did you do that? They were saying things like, don't agree with putting the material back into the ocean, it's dumping, it's pollution or whatever. So what they're revealing is that this isn't their choices where they pick 6 of those. It's not about them looking at the alternative and saying, oh, that's not enough money, or, oh, I'd like to actually let divers in. They're sort of using a different heuristic in making their choices. They're basically just saying, nah, really don't think that rigs-to-reefs is a good idea. We shouldn't have it. Doesn't matter what you give me. Doesn't matter how much money you give me. I just don't think it's a good idea. It's nothing about the attributes. So they have to be taken out of the estimation stage, because obviously their behavior is completely different to everybody who's making these trade-off choices. So they need to come out of the analysis. We're not going to forget them. They're an important set, but they can't be put into the DCE. But what we can do is put them back into a hybrid model, because basically we now have this observed data, which is, did they do protest behavior? So we can link that to a whole stack of stuff, and went simple, just going to link it to this, the social latent variable. And it's only the social one that I put into the utility here. Why not both? Because they're correlated. Why not the economic one? Because the social one seemed to have a better performance in terms of fit. It seemed to be the one which was driving. So we can start to build this up in a more complete way. Okay, what are we going to do? We remove that sample and put it to one side. We asked them in a debriefing questions whether or not they attended, whether some of the attributes were relevant to them. And this is a form of stated attribute non-attendance that some people are just saying, okay, it was in the choice set, but I ignored it. It just wasn't important to me. We get that information. We asked them whether they'd gone diving or fishing. We thought that might have some impact on the marginal utility for access. And we only use this social legitimacy variable, the SLO, as a interaction with the ASC on complete removal. So you might think, well, social license might change the way you think about liability or about the money. Well, possibly, but we've simplified it to say it's only going to affect the ASC part, which is the utility associated with complete removal. And we sort of think the prior hypothesis was people who give a high level of social license to the industry are probably more willing to accept the rigs-to-reefs, less likely to pick the complete removal choice. So again, it's mirrors what happened in the protests analysis, but this is about within this the choice component. Okay, bit of background. We asked them a whole series of questions. One of them was about whether they've been fishing or diving. We've also got avidity questions in terms of the amount of fishing and diving they do, and I regret not using that, and that's the next phase, to actually explore more about avidity as an impact. But at the moment, it's just whether they answered yes or no to fishing and diving, and those are the distributions of when they were asked what was relevant to them. You can see that they're not particularly fussed about attraction versus production. They are fussed about threatened species, because we describe those as iconic. And the liability one, as in, is the other one which comes up as being important. Okay, remember, I'm going to show you a series of 3 or so graphs, tables. They're going to be the standard coefficients and standard errors, but remember, these have all come out of a single model. I'm going to do this in bits. And in fact, I'm going to give you bits of bits. So this is what comes out of the SLO model. So this is, can we explain what determines the social license to operate? The bit I'm not showing you is the 85 parameters from 15 ordered logit models, which are sitting behind this as well. I thought you wouldn't want to absorb that. So this is just explaining this relationship, the relationship between these observed characteristics and their inferred social license to operate. So the economic one, the only one that pops is age. Older people more likely to give the social license. On the social one, the environmental concern, that was a question that was asked right at the very beginning, which was just, are you concerned about the state of the environment? Scale of 1 to 5. The more concerned they are about the environment, the lower the social license they give to the industry. Whether they have worked in the oil and gas industry, generally defined. Positive, yes, not surprisingly, they're more likely to. We have the little protest model. This is the only thing that were in there. This was the social legitimacy variable. Yay, negative. The higher the social license they give to the industry, the less likely they are to be in the protest group. And now we come through all these estimates in terms of so these are the coefficients, the marginal utilities out of the DCE. In some sense, the things that we might actually be interested in trying to understand about their attitudes towards rigs-to-reef. And at the moment, we're just going to look at sign and significance. So biomass, yes, they like it higher utility if the reef is going to generate more outcome. The production versus attraction, if it's production and they don't attend to it, not significant. If they do attend to it, positive and significant. If it creates habitat for endangered species, marginally positive. If they said they didn't attend to it, large and significant positive. If they said they did attend to it. Access. So the base setting is that there's no access at all to this stuff. It's just a little reef and it's going to be like a little mini MPA. Okay, what happens if we say that we can give access to divers? If you're a non-diver, you don't care. Basically, it doesn't change utility whether or not you're going to let divers in. If you're a diver, you do care, as in you're much likely to be picking an option of a reef if you know that you're going to be allowed to, or potentially diving could happen on it. The fisher one. If you give access to fishers, if you're a non-fisher, as in people, then that's turning up as negative. So basically what it says is that the non-fishing community is basically saying they'd like to see this thing protected and not exploited, or not have any extraction out of that fishery, out of that system. So they'd rather not see these reefs that are created actually having fishers having access to them. If you're a fisher, it goes the other way. It's positive. And this is where I think the avidity would really would change what you're seeing. I think if I split this out into the people who were saying that they were fishing every month, that's going to be a much bigger effect. So that's a regret that we didn't do that. We've got the data, we can do it next time round. But we're seeing sort of interpretable things. Liability. Joint liability, they don't seem to care about. Liability, if it only lies with the government. Here, this kicks in with a big negative, even for the people who said that liability wasn't important. If they see that the liability for this stuff lies with the government, they don't like the option. If it's sole liability and they attend to it, they really don't like it. Revenue is positive, or the people who attend to it, yes, they'd rather see more money go to the state government than not. The ASC is interpreted as being the utility associated with the opt-out one. And it's all relative and it's a bit tricky to think about, but essentially that big negative number means that there's a tendency for people to pick the other options, the rigs-to-reefs options, not the complete removal. Then the interesting bit is the interaction. So this is the ASC and the effect of social legitimacy. So the higher that is, i.e. the bigger the social license I'm giving to oil and gas industry, the more likely I am that I'm going to opt in for the rigs-to-reefs programs. Or alternatively, people who don't give social license to the oil and gas company are more likely to be picking option 3. And these are people who are trading off. These aren't the protesters, these are the trade-off people. And there's there's a random parameter on the ASC as well. Okay, for those people who are familiar with this stuff, what you're expecting to see now are part words, which are sort of monetary values associated with changing an attribute. So we could have expressed those in terms of how many $1 million would you be willing to give up for the state in order to get a good thing in terms of access to it. I'm not going to do those. We can do them, but they're not, I think, as interesting. What we want to do instead is look at probabilities. So we can take these models, we can construct an artificial reef with a particular set of characteristics, and we can sort of pose the hypothetical question, ex post after rest. What's the probability that somebody would pick that option rather than the complete removal? So we can see how big those affect, though we can just see they're positive or whatever, and they're significant. Okay, how much does it change the probability they're going to accept a reefing? So the base reef is sort of a very vanilla one, low biomass and revenue, no habitat, it attracts stuff, this hasn't got access, the government has liability. And then comes some caveats. These are not, the numbers you're about to see are not sample averages. They are the predicted response of a particular type of person. There may only be one of that person in the sample. So you can't infer anything from this about community acceptability. It's about what's the responsiveness of the choices to the attributes for a particular type of person. And the second caveat is I'm about to report Veronica's results, not the hybrid ones, because I'm not confident that I've done it right with the probabilities for the hybrid model. Need to check them, and we might want to talk about that in a minute as to why I think that, but I just didn't feel confident They're all much bigger, and I don't know why, and I'm a bit worried about it. And I think it's operator error if it's happening. I think I may have just made a mistake. So we'll just look at Veronica's, which I think are going to tell the story. So oh, I could have gone back up. How do you read this? Well, this is the base reef. This is the level of, for her, she used economic legitimacy. If that's at its lowest level, there's a 51% chance you'd pick it. For somebody at the highest level, 85%. So this social legitimacy idea is really quite influential in the probability you're going to pick the reef. Instead of removal, if that's your binary choice, one or the other.
So, okay, it's binary. You only have option 3 or removal.
Yeah, only two things. We've taken it down to a 2 alternative binary choice, so now I can just talk about the probability of picking a reef. So social license is really quite important in driving that. And again, the caveat, there may not be many people down here at 1, but if there is anybody down here at 1, they don't like it, and the guys up here at 5 do. Now we can start playing games. We can just say, well, what happens if the reef's got habitat, and I tend to the habitat? The probability jumps up to 0.7. The pattern's the same. At the end, it all gets compressed, so the differences aren't that big, because we're nearly at 1 anyway, so changes aren't so I'm going to just look at what on this column. If you add biomass, has a bit of an impact going from the lowest to the highest level, and I pretend to biomass. If it's production versus attraction, a bit of an impact. If you have access, so this is the effect of the different people. So this is the base reef, but now I'm going to let some divers get access to it. If I'm not a diver, it doesn't change the chance, probably I'll pick it. If I am a diver, it does, quite a reasonable kick. For fishers, if I'm not a fisher, the probabilities drop from 51% down to 43. If I am a fisher, it goes back up and larger. So this is starting to put just those coefficients there, positive, negative, significant. Yeah. Okay, now we're seeing where they actually have some sort of economic impact. And then the bottom set, the socioeconomic ones, this is where there's a big impact. When we go and take the base reef and just say, and the government's going to be responsible for it, we've gone from a 51% acceptance by this lowest level down to 32%. And as you go across, it's only when we get up to the 3rd level of economic legitimacy that we're starting to see a 50-50 chance we're going to pick it. So that liability value, which as I said, is a big number. Well, the reason that I can say it's a big number is that it's actually having a big impact on the probabilities. Yeah. Okay, conclusions. In general, we had no idea, when we did this, had absolutely no idea what was going to happen in terms of what the responses were going to be like. We thought that either we can get everybody piling in saying, yes, this is a good idea, or we thought we could get everybody piling out and saying, no, this is an awful idea, as in, and all of them just picking the complete removal option, which would have been a very short thesis for Veronica to write up. So we had absolutely no idea how people were going to respond to this. And we seem to have got quite a high level of acceptability in terms of the rig-to-reef. It depends on the characteristics, but we did think we might just see complete aversion. But there is this little group which are important and we can't ignore, which is, there is that sort of 9–10% who basically just oppose this, whatever you do. The preferences, okay, they're high, they put threatened species and so on, lower, and particularly if, I think the big drivers in terms of differentials are the liability one and the social license one. Okay, next steps. I need to work out whether or not my other numbers are right. This is the conditional estimates of the SLO. There's these latent variables floating about in here, which are unobservable. And yet I need to extract them out of it in order to better work out what the impact is of, and that's the bit I don't know whether I've done right. Want to go back and look at divers and fishers to see if there's heterogeneity in the groups. I need, in anticipation of a question, I would need to go and check, as in this issue about goodness of fit, as for these models, have I got a good measurement model for my social license? It would be nice to expand it up to national sample rather than just WA. At the start, I said that we were surprised that there wasn't much published stuff going on in this space in terms of community attitudes towards doing this rigs-to-reef process. That's true, but as a quick spruik, There is an FRDC funded project that's currently underway, which is looking at this and a much wider set of issues. It's led by Ewan Harvey out of Curtin. There's a whole bunch of ecologists sitting in here. There's some social scientists from UWA in Curtin, and there's me and Johanna and Kelly and Paul McLeod doing economic stuff. So hopefully, no, hopefully it has to happen. By the start of next year, 2021, the reports on that will come out, and it's a much broader set of issues in terms of trying to measure social values associated with this, beyond just rigs to reefs, but things like piers, jetties, and so on, a much bigger question. So there's going to be a hopefully quite a nice suite of work which looks at this issue from a broader set of perspectives than just the one that I've talked about today. So thank you. So, I reckon we do have a slight issue that I don't think that the remote people, when they talk, it's not going to come through the speakers. We're now in a big room. So what I'm going to say is if anybody in the room wants to ask a question, can they come down and ask it in that? If it's a long question, ask it in that. I'll repeat short ones, but if there's a major question, Curtis, then come down and come down and talk it in here, and I'll switch that microphone on, and I'll try to answer the question. Dave.
I would have liked to know how many people there were in the different categories of social license funded borrowing.
Okay, so I can. So that Dave asked about the distribution of preference of social license. I can't do that for the hybrid because that's the thing I don't know I've extracted outright. That's the distribution, not very neatly distributed for you, for social versus economic. So what you can see is, okay, so if we took the economic one, there's not many people down here. So this is on a scale from 1 to 5. Yeah. And it's sort of clustered up. It's quite clustered in the middle. There are some people who don't give it on either criteria. There's some who give it on both.
So that says that if Ryan's numbers are right, there's actually quite strong support.
Yes. So we've sort of did a bit of that after Veronica finished hers, in terms of looking at we took those base reefs and worked out what the probability of each person in the sample would do. And it was high support for those who are doing the trade-off, and then the 10% saying no, but some other people saying no as well. And that's what I'd hoped better show for this other from ours, and that's what we'd go to. That's why the numbers you've seen on probabilities are not community acceptance. They're for this person down here, the one person or the few people down here who are not giving a social license. That's how they would behave. But you're right, the bulk of people are up here and will be giving, I think, high levels of support. Okay. Have I unmuted you?
Yep. Hi, can you hear me?
Very quietly, because it's coming through our computer, our laptop speakers. But go for it.
Okay. The protester group in this study, unlike other studies, are really the ones who toe the line of the law. And I was wondering if you know how many of them just are maybe protesters because of that. They just follow the law.
So people didn't catch that as to whether or not people were thinking about, well, this is what the current regulations say, and therefore we should just support the current regulations.
Yes.
They were being given, they were sort of in the framing of it, they were told, well, we're investigating the possibilities of changing this. So it was obviously framed as if this could change, this is how policy could evolve, and therefore we're asking for your opinion about this. So hopefully they were, well, hopefully they were taking the opportunity to express their views. It could be that if they actually found it difficult to create or express a view, that they just thought, well, if that's what's currently right, then we should keep on. I mean, not necessarily that they're just sort of following the law, but they might just be really anchored on the fact that, well, if currently regulations say this is the best way to do it, they might have been anchored on, well, I don't really understand what's going on, therefore I'll just say, let's stick with what we've got. So it may just be that they were sticking with that, but some of that might be true, but the fact that we can explain that behavior from the social license variable suggests that there might be something else going on as well.
Yep. Okay. And the other, I had another comment, which is from, I'm a biologist, and the advantage of keeping a reef-to-rigs program is often related to how much fishing opportunities are there. I was wondering if in a new iteration of the study, if a choice could be given to the participants of whether their action of fishing there is positive or neutral or negative to the natural fishing population, because of course the fish are all going to aggregate there, and maybe it's a trap for them. Yeah. And this is not a consideration that they probably had to grapple with in this iteration of your survey, but I was wondering if maybe it would be of importance to participants.
Yeah, so I don't know if people can hear this up at the back, Ram, can you get the question? Yeah. So yes, that could be one of the limits on doing these types of studies is how much how many attributes you can put in and how much information you can put into them. It might be that they're already thinking about that, and that is part of the way that they are thinking about that they're bringing their native understanding, interpretation to the situation, and deciding when they make their choices that they're making some judgment as to whether they're going to have an impact. I have been thinking about possibly doing interactions, as in, if you're a fisher, do you think differently about aggregation versus acute, and things like that. But at the moment, I'm trying to keep the model as simple as possible, but we might be able to pick up some of those effects even in this model if we went again.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. No, one.
Related. What's the advantage of having the social license in explaining behaviour? On the model, you still use the same observable individual explain the social license, and you explain quite a bit of that variation. So why not just go right to using the conventional approach, and that way you avoid the moment error, and also going one step further with this arguably noisy model to address that thing. Second, what new information or some leverage you can provide the policymaker with by having this new information? Isn't it better to focus on those observable characteristics? After all the results are not surprising. Sorry about that. Higher acceptance associated with higher social license. What's surprising here? Okay,
what surprises us is that we could bolt these two things together, that we actually, the measures that we're getting out of one, which is like a completely different, so the social license questions weren't based upon anything about rigs to reefs, it was about generic. And the fact that that information seems to be useful in explaining what their choices are, I found that surprising. It worked. Why not just go straight back down to just let the attributes sit in there? Well, then you end up with the game that we always end up playing, which is, oh, look, older people, men, people who, they've changed their behavior. And then you have the question, why? And then we wave our hands and say, well, perhaps you can make up a story about why these people are doing this. And we then try to infer, we usually end up trying to infer something about why what we've measured from the characteristics, what the causal link was. Well, here we potentially are helping to see whether or not there's a causal link which comes through the SLO stuff. It might help us understand a bit more about what that process is. I think being able to unpack this into segments is quite interesting, as in if this is about acceptability, you might then think that depending upon what your perspective is, as to, you know, where you like to find your objections to, or so I think it is unpacking it more. The more you can, I think the more you can unpack it and explain what those processes, the better, I think. That, I think, is the advantage. Yeah.
How variable do you think the social license to operate is in the short term for an individual? And do you think it's impacted by knowledge? So like, it's a very complex, decommissioning is a very complex issue, and the knowledge of the different parts that make up decommissioning option.
So this, I see the second one. The social license one isn't about decommissioning.
Yeah.
So they don't need to have information about decommissioning in order to have given me a response about whether or not what they feel about oil and gas. But we're using what their general views about the industry in order to explain their perspectives on decommissioning. Information, yeah. So we give them some information as is coming in. We try to make it as factual as we can in the context of getting them through a survey in 10, 15 minutes. We can't give them a lecture, whatever, to go through. But it is likely, you'd have thought, and so we did ask them about, where was that one? It was that one. As in, we asked them self-reported things about their knowledge of the oil and gas industry, for example, as in how familiar with it. They didn't seem to be driving this, but working in did have, but yeah, so the whole issue of knowledge and understanding in these things is always an important question. And you can go two ways with that. You can either say, unless they understand it, then their responses are worthless, because why would you trust somebody's responses? The other one is, well, this is just the responses that people have got in the community, and this is we let them walk about and do other stuff, like buy other goods and cars and petrol and whatever, and do stuff, you know, and vote. It's an interest in actually seeing how, given their native understanding, beliefs, or whatever, how they bring that to this context. So I sort of go more down that route, that we're trying to understand how people think and responding, not necessarily trying to sort of say, well, you obviously didn't understand the ecology, therefore you're wrong. Just, okay, given your understanding, this is the way that you've responded to this set of questions. Are there questions coming in on the?
I just have one comment from Steve. That he said any previous studies on old shipwrecks that have become artificial reefs, like they could serve as a comparison for your study and suggest similar or dissimilar outcomes.
Part of the outcome from the bigger project, there's a review of all the work that's done on valuation for marine infrastructure, rigs-to-reefs, pipelines. So yes, so you can wander down the corridor and talk to Johanna, who was responsible for putting all that together. Yes, there's a whole stack of other stuff. Not usually done, well, some of it has been done like this actually, but usually by fishers, about their attitudes towards, you know, how that changes their behavior. Yeah.
I was curious about the production versus attraction. That didn't seem to be a real big driver in your experiment. Is it really good news? Because I felt that's the big customer base, like what I'm understanding of. If it's not that important, then that's fine. Because it's all about that. You know if it's important or not. But did you test whether people are understanding that concept?
That was my point about the knowledge.
Okay, so no. So once you go beyond that into, we described it to them of saying, well, there's this issue, as in we don't really know whether the fish are just being produced, extra fish, or whether they're just turning up, as in they're just being attracted from somewhere. So we gave them that in a paragraph, in 2 or 3 sentences. Okay, do we run a test to say, what's the difference between attraction and production? But no, we haven't done that. So yeah, the lack of attention to it either means, oh, I didn't think that's important, or it means I didn't understand it and therefore I've ignored it. So that's a bit of a, yeah, that's, but I would, okay, no.
Okay. Thank you so much, Michael, for this most interesting presentation, and thank you all for joining us. But the next week we have Dr. Maxim Poldukov from Landcare Research, New Zealand, who's going to tell us about the cost of algal blooms in the Swan Canning River system. So please join us again next week. Thank you all very much, and thank you again, Michael.